From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Karoline Leavitt.
The Fed holds rates as expected, with Chair Powell pressed on the influence President Trump will have on future policy.
I'm not going to have any response or comment whatsoever on what the president said. It's not appropriate for me to do so.
This is two cabinet nominees, RFK Jr. and Howard Lutnick, are grilled in confirmation hearings on Capitol Hill. We'll have more on the personalities and priorities in the second Trump administration with a member of the first one, Marc, former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence.
And the White House rescinds its order freezing federal grants after it was temporarily blocked by a judge and faced pushback from Democrats. We'll have reaction this hour from Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Thanks for being with us on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. The late edition, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Karoline Leavitt in Washington. Kind of a split screen today, Kaylee, as Jay Powell was walking into the room to talk to reporters. Donald Trump was walking into the East Room to do his own business, hopefully trying to get on TV and maybe influence interest rate policy.
Yeah, counter-programming a little bit, though he was mostly talking about the Lake and Riley Act, some other priorities of his administration. It was when he took to Truth Social a little while ago that he expressed his dissatisfaction with Fed's rate decision today.
Yes, indeed. We, of course, brought you special coverage of the Fed's decision, the news conference that followed. Here's Chair Powell from a short time ago.
We don't know what will happen with tariffs, with immigration, with fiscal policy, and with regulatory policy. We're only just beginning to see, actually are not really beginning to see much. And I think we need to let those policies be articulated before we can even begin to make a plausible assessment of what their implications for the economy will be.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Michael McKee, who followed up with Chairman Powell after those initial remarks on the future of policy and its impact. He clearly did not want to be answering these questions, Mike, but it was kind of different than what we got from him in December and what the statement said in December around the idea that they are thinking about what policy could look like.
Well, I think he set a stage in December for two things. One is that we need to worry about what the president's going to do because we don't know how that will affect the economy, but I'm not quitting. And now he's made that clear, so he doesn't need to talk about that anymore. And he went out of his way today telling one reporter the second reporter who asked about it, he said, not commenting, I'll give you a mulligan. You could ask another question. But the idea that the Fed doesn't know what's coming was very well articulated in that soundbite there. The Fed can't really move until it has a better idea, which raises the possibility they don't do anything in March either.
Fed independence takes on new meaning, I guess, with Donald Trump back in the White House. We talked earlier today on the early edition of Balance of Power with Betsy Stevenson, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. This was before the rate announcement. Here's what she had to say about the president's influence over the Fed.
The good news for Jay Powell is he doesn't actually need to get President Trump's approval. That's actually a really important part of maintaining stable prices and a low inflation and maximum employment is that we have an independent central bank. And one of the things the independent central bank is supposed to do is keep the economy operating sort of right at potential. When the federal government is making a lot of radical decisions, it could end up spiking inflation or causing a recession.
So what's this going to look like the second time around? President Trump in the Oval Office was asked just the other day, do you think the Fed's going to listen? He said, oh, yeah, I think so. Doesn't seem like they're listening.
They're not going to listen to his entreaties to do something. They have to decide in March and then going on from there whether they want to cut because they think that they're too tight right now. The difference between this and the first term is that point they were raising rates. Now there's no talk of raising rates really unless inflation starts to go back up again, which gives them a perfect excuse. And I think today the tweet we ended up seeing from President Trump was kind of rather weirdly phrased. It wasn't about interest rate policy. It was about the Fed being woke and DEI and things like that. Because I think he has to recognize the fact that he hasn't put out his programs yet, so they can't really decide what to do.
Pretty remarkable note. He says because Jay Powell and the Fed failed to stop the problem they created, he will be the one to fix it, Kaylee. So I guess stay tuned for more from the White House. Bloomberg's Michael McKee, always great to have you in Washington, certainly on a Fed day. Also today, confirmation hearings for two of President Trump's cabinet picks, Howard Lutnick for Commerce and the controversial nominee for Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. His testimony focusing in large part today on his past criticisms of vaccines.
I believe that that vaccines play a critical role in healthcare. All of my kids are vaccinated. I've written many books on vaccines. My first book in 2014, the first line of it is, I am not anti-vaccine, and the last line is, I am not anti-vaccine.
Joining us now for more, Bloomberg's Laura Davison, who is glued to these confirmation hearings. Another split screen today, actually. We had Lutnick and RFK Jr. up there at the same time. Laura, did he get the job done? He said that he doesn't have a problem with the polio vaccine, with the measles vaccine. Is that all that lawmakers really needed to hear?
He certainly adopted a different tone than he had in his public statements prior. You know, he said he's not anti-vaccine, but it's clear from his prior public statements that he is at least vaccine skeptical. What's not clear, though, is that this is going to block him from nomination. It seems very likely that he will sail through the Senate. He has a second round of hearings tomorrow with the HELP committee, which is the Health and Education Committee in the Senate. They won't actually vote on his nomination, but it does not seem like Senate Republicans are lining up to challenge his nomination here.
I guess we'll see how things go for Tulsi Gabbard tomorrow, as well as Kash Patel. Still have a lot to look forward to. I do want to ask you, though, about something that has developed very quickly over the last few days, and that was the original memo from the Office of Management and Budget freezing federal grants and aid. That now rescinded today in the face of pushback from a judge and from many others here in Washington. But the White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, said on Twitter, this is not a rescission of the federal funding freeze. It is simply a rescission of the OMB memo. What exactly is happening here, Laura?
So this is a little bit of face saving from the administration. What they're saying here is, look, we're still going to be going through all the federal spending, these loans and grants, and looking for things that are tied to some of the other executive orders they put out. So this is things like DEI, funding that's going to non-governmental organizations, foreign aid, clean energy, all of those priorities. That's still happening. But sort of this blanket freeze that had really caused a lot of chaos and panic across the country yesterday, that the end of this order sort of subsides that. But what Karoline Leavitt also said, and I think this is really important, is that they're going to be issuing further actions related to federal spending. You know, we reported earlier today that the administration is gearing up to challenge Congress's federal spending authority. They want to wrestle some of that back towards the White House. That's going to be a big fight. And this is, I think, an analogy here would be looking back towards the Muslim ban during the first administration, where they issued a very broad ban that was struck down, and they came back several weeks later with a more narrow and targeted one. That's likely what we're to see in the coming days.
Yeah, sounds familiar. You know, every time you turn around, it's another headline out of this White House. That the president did make a surprise announcement today. He was talking about something entirely different, about his plans now to build a new migrant holding facility, keeping mass deportations in mind. Listen.
Today, I'm also signing an executive order to instruct the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security to begin preparing the 30,000-person migrant facility at Guantanamo Bay. Most people don't even know about it. We have 30,000 beds in Guantanamo to detain the worst criminal illegal aliens threatening the American people.
So it's back to Gitmo. Is this legal? Is that all he needs?
There are
executive order?
A ton of questions about that. There's both an executive order, you know, and sort of national security questions of potentially mixing, potential people who have allegations of terrorism with unauthorized migrants, as well as the funding piece. Congress is going to have to come in and fund a bunch of this, and that is wholly unclear if there are the votes to kind of keep Guantanamo alive in this way.
Wow.
All right. Bloomberg's Laura Davison, thank you so much. And coming up, we'll get more reaction to the White House's sudden reversal on freezing federal grants. Live from Capitol Hill, Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Donald Trump rescinded the OMB order. Now he should rescind the nomination of Russell Vought. When the Trump administration announced this awful directive on Monday night, we knew immediately it was short-sighted, disastrous, cruel, and dumb. It was clear then, as it is now, that the directive was given without any comprehension of what it actually called for, let alone the ramifications on literally hundreds of millions of Americans.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer earlier today on the Trump administration's federal aid freeze reversal. And, of course, on President Trump's pick to run the Office of Management and Budget. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. Congresswoman, thank you for being here. We've heard from the White House press secretary that this was simply a rescission of the OMB memo, not a rescission of the federal funding freeze itself. Is the only way this ends when a court decides?
That appears to be the only way it's going to get resolved. At this point, I think what the administration is doing is playing a game of hide the ball. They had a massive negative backlash against this memo that was a sweeping Republican ripoff of every grant program in the entire federal government. The Medicaid portal was closed in all 50 states yesterday until they had so much backlash that they had to reopen it and say that it wasn't going to apply there. They are literally halting funding for feeding vulnerable children, for pregnant mothers, for homeless veterans, and cancer patients, cancer research. My transportation agency here in South Florida was ceasing operations as of 5 p.m. yesterday. So the chaos is the point, and they had so much backlash that they rescinded the memo, to try to stave off the judge who put a pause on the freeze in court yesterday. That didn't work, and the judge saw exactly what was going on and decided to issue a restraining order. So my understanding at the moment is there's a restraining order on the freeze, but they are, make no mistake, they are reviewing every federal grant and program, and their intent is to pause that funding, steal that funding, and deny millions and millions of people the vital funds they need to be able to sustain their lives, save their lives, transportation and the economy. How any of this actually impacts bringing down costs for the average American is beyond me. On the contrary, it will increase costs.
Mm-hmm. Well, we should note that the White House did suggest that the way this freeze was being portrayed was a media hoax. But it does seem to be just the motivator that House Democrats needed, Congresswoman, as House Republicans gather for their retreat at Doral in Miami this week. Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries called an emergency meeting for your caucus today to roll out the strategy, reportedly a three-pronged strategy to push back on this. Were you in that meeting? What happened?
I was in our meeting, and I don't really talk about what happens in our caucus meetings publicly, but it's not a secret that we're fighting back, that we're going to stop this Republican ripoff, and that they do not have the right legally or constitutionally to go after funds that Congress already appropriated. We are constitutionally granted the sole authority to appropriate funds, and the president can't just do whatever he wants after the appropriations bills become law. What they are doing, though, Joe, is they are bullying these organizations and people who are fearful that they're going to lose vital funds that sustain people's lives. And so many of them are afraid and unwilling to come forward. In my state, we have a governor who, if local government elected officials come forward, he might suspend them and kick them out of office because he's shown the penchant to do that. So members of Congress, as in the Democratic caucus, we're standing up, we're fighting back. We're going to use every tool at our disposal to make sure that we can expose what the Republican ripoff is going to, how it's going to impact millions and millions of people, how it's going to really hurt our economy. And there are organizations that are going to fight this in court and already are and have been successful thus far. So we're going to be relentless.
Well, Congresswoman, if you listen to the House Speaker, while you may be relentless, he views it as an effort that is leaderless at this time. This is what Speaker Johnson had to say about the future of leadership in the Democratic Party, and we'll have you respond.
Everything has changed. You've seen that the president has accomplished more in his first week in office than Joe Biden did for the American people in 4 years. And everyone's talking about it. The Democratic Party is in disarray. They have no obvious leader. They have no obvious vision or agenda. Their platform has to be rewritten whole cloth. And they don't exactly know how they're going to wander in this wilderness for the next couple of years. It's not just going to be a couple of years, though. It's going to be 4 years at least, and then more.
Obviously, Congresswoman, there will be a new DNC chair, a job you used to hold, selected this weekend. Is it that person that is going to have to lead this charge? Is it Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, or someone else?
Let's be very clear. Joe Biden handed Donald Trump the strongest economy in the entire world. He is the only president in modern times that had positive job numbers in every single year he was president. We passed the CHIPS and Science Act and brought chip manufacturing back to this country. We passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and made trillions of dollars of investment that right now is what Donald Trump is planning to freeze, which is going to devastate our economy, which is going to cancel people's jobs. We passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which brought down prescription drug costs for millions, the largest, most significant climate change impact, to make sure that the climate change that is crushing economies across the country is going to start to help improve. And Donald Trump, in the first 9 days, signed 200 executive orders to start to roll all that back. What happened to the promise to bring Americans' kitchen table costs down? Last time when I went to the grocery store a couple of days ago, eggs are still off the charts, and nothing's happened to prices. And I've seen nothing from Donald Trump to address people's personal expenses. It's the last thing that people wanted was what Donald Trump is handing them. And because they're overreaching, we will have a successful midterm in 2 years and take the House back.
Well, considering the accomplishments that you just rolled out and knowing that you actually did run the DNC yourself at one point, how does it make you feel knowing that your party elders told Joe Biden not to run, told him to go home?
Look, we are moving forward. And like I said, Joe Biden handed Donald Trump the most robust economy in the world. And I ran on our accomplishments under Joe Biden's administration, was proud to help bring insulin costs in Medicare down to $35 a month. By the way, Donald Trump just signed an executive order to cancel Joe Biden's plans to bring prescription drug costs for generics down to $2 and $3. Donald Trump doesn't care about people's kitchen table costs. He cares about making enough room so that he can give more tax breaks to billionaires and millionaires. And that contrast is very clear. The pain is the point with Donald Trump and his cronies in the House and Senate. And so we're going to fight back. We had a victory in the last day in court, and with the president having to roll back that memo. But we're going to stay on the watch because we know they haven't rolled back the policy. It's an unpopular, horrific, painful policy that we're not going to just lay down and allow them to do.
Well, it's good to have you back, Congresswoman. When you get back in Washington, let's keep talking about this. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, we thank you for being with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, tech earnings in full swing. Microsoft, Meta, Tesla, all reporting results after the bell. We'll take a close look next with the host of Bloomberg Technology. Karoline Hyde is with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Several major tech companies released their earnings in the last hour post-market, including Meta, Tesla, and Microsoft. Meta and Tesla positive after their results. Microsoft down about 2% in after-hours trading. And joining us now for more is the host of Bloomberg Technology, Karoline Hyde. Karoline, I want to start with Meta because we were just hearing from Mark Zuckerberg on the earnings call about the new administration, which he says will unlock innovation. And he said Meta is redefining its relationship to governments. What does that mean?
Well, they also talk about the regulatory overhang that continues in the EU, and that is something that the CFO, Susan Lee, spoke to in the earnings announcement. So they are trying to redefine. We've seen the redefinement. You've seen lack of fact-checking coming in the United States. You've seen Mark Zuckerberg make the pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago several times. Dana White is on the board. There has been this ultimate shift towards, maybe from a fiduciary duty perspective, the next administration. Clearly, he thinks it's going to align with innovation. It's interesting that also the Wall Street Journal was reporting just before the earnings struck, and I'd say they were pretty delayed, by the way, which is very unusual, that Trump is likely to be signing an agreement calling on Meta to pay $25 million to settle a case where he was, of course, aggravated about being kicked off of the platforms in 2021. No comment from Meta on that particular point. But overall, these were numbers that showed fourth quarter was strong, but they signal first quarter is going to be somewhat dimmer in terms of the revenue outlook that the market had been anticipating. Still growth, but not as high as had been anticipated. They're still committed to spending. They're still plowing it into AI. They're still driving generative AI across their products, whether it's being on Instagram, in Reels, on advertising, becoming that much more acute to you to ensure that you're seeing what you want to see. And that, of course, helps them drive up the cost of advertising. The pricing goes higher, and it means that they can bring in revenue from advertisers. But they're still spending big. Expenditures go up. That's on AI infrastructure. But notably, they're also bigging up the headcount a little bit as well. And notably, perhaps anticipating a little bit of regulatory crackdown still from the EU.
AI, of course, emerging here in Microsoft's quarterly report as well, Karoline, watching services grow, but hurt a bit by limited data center capacity, which is interesting based on the conversation we were having about DeepSeek just a couple of days ago. The whole point was you might not need all these data centers. There might be a cheaper solution. How do you rationalize these two storylines?
Well, ultimately, you saw Satya Nadella trying to say, Jevons paradox. Ultimately, the more AI we use, the more that you're going to need all the wheels that grease that. And that, of course, does mean compute. That means cloud. And that means what they currently offer. Indeed, that's NVIDIA's line of argument as well. You still need our GPUs, even if you see DeepSeek, because you need our inference. But I think what's interesting with Microsoft is they're also ultimately seeing generative AI not feed through to the ultimate Azure revenue as quickly as had been anticipated. Ultimately, they're seeing 21% growth in 31% growth in Azure on a quarter-on-quarter basis, slightly slowing down. But they're still saying AI is bringing the percentage point increase that you want to see. But from that commitment to spend, they're showing that they're going to be disciplined. Amy Hood really making that clear as a CFO on that particular part of the business. They're having to spend on infrastructure still. They're having to commit, but notably because remember, Oracle was the one next to Trump recently talking about AI infrastructure with OpenAI, right. Not Microsoft, because Microsoft hasn't got the capacity for OpenAI.
There you have it. What a treat to have Karoline Hyde with us up late on Balance of Power. On an earnings night, no less. Karoline, thank you. Microsoft shares, by the way, down 2%. We'll have a lot more ahead. Marc Short joins us next with a look at the new Trump administration right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We have to be unanimous. It's we have to get to that point where we're unanimous. The beautiful diversity of thought that we have in the Republican conference is such that we're going to have to make a play call at some point and move forward. And I think that's what you're going to, if we're going to meet the timeline that we're trying to meet, we're going to have to probably get this resolution done within by the middle of February. So we're going to make a call, move forward, and see if we can galvanize the conference to get behind something.
It's Congressman Blake Moore of Utah earlier today providing a bit of an update on the House Republicans' plan to pass a reconciliation bill. This coming after the conference holed up for 3 days of strategy sessions at President Trump's golf resort in Doral, Florida. As the retreat wraps up now, we're joined by Marc Short, former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence in the first Trump administration, Republican strategist. Marc, it's great to have you back. It's been too long. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I never thought I'd say this, seems to sum it all up. In a very long tweet, she writes, after 2 days at our House Republican winter retreat, we still do not have a plan on budget reconciliation, and our speaker and his team have not offered one. She says even though President Trump literally told us here at the start of our conference, he now doesn't care if it's one bill or two. So does Mike Johnson need to make the game call or what?
Well, Joe, thanks for having me back. I think the reality is that your viewers' expectations probably need to be dialed back some. I think that there's a lot of anticipation of the Republican House, Senate, White House that just the renewal of the Trump tax relief would happen quickly. That's not going to be the case. Budget reconciliation is really tough. it would be surprising to me if it meets that mid-February deadline. When we passed tax relief in 2017, I at the time was Trump's head of legislative affairs. It took us a while to pass a budget, and then it took us till the end of the year to actually pass tax relief. And even then, we lost 12 House Republicans on that final bill, primarily because of SALT. But, you know, Speaker Johnson has a margin of maybe 2. By the time you get to final vote, 3 or 4. So his margins are going to be incredibly tight. And to think that you're going to actually get budget approved first and then this final bill, it's not going to happen quickly.
So is it only our viewers that need to adjust their expectations, Mark, or does the president need to as well? What is he not going to get that he's asking for?
Well, Kaylee, that's a great question. I think that the notion that with these tight margins, you're going to include things like no taxes on tips. The president's even asked to include as part of his trade agenda in there, that you're going to change the SALT deduction significantly. I think that all of those expectations are probably out of line. I do think, though, that candidly, extending the current package should be considered a win. And so I think some of these expectations certainly are too high. So yes, it's much broader than simply your viewers. I think that's just been the general consensus that Republicans will do this. And I think the prospect of a $5 trillion tax increase will end up getting people in line at the end, but I think it's going to go all the way to the end of the year deadline.
If it's going to take this long to write tax legislation, knowing how complex it is and how many components have been at least proposed, if not added, since 2017, Mark, why not break this into 2? Why not get border legislation out the door now? Yeah. Isn't that what voters want?
I think that the Senate wants to do 2 bills in part, I think, actually, to Kaylee's question, that it would help satisfy Trump's itch to have something accomplished. And you could say we won on that. But I think for House Republicans, candidly, they need to keep the border bill together because they know that House Republicans will not want to vote against a border bill. So keeping them together in one giant bill actually keeps their conference in line. And if you break it off, then it's going to be easier for some Republicans to break away from the final tax package. So I think there's an incentive for House Republicans to say, look, we want to have one bill that kind of keeps our conference together because our margin is so tight we can't afford to lose anybody.
Well, so if we're considering early wins here, we've heard the president repeatedly in recent days pointing to all of the executive orders that he signed right out of the gate. And I do wonder, as someone who was in the first Trump White House, how you view the kind of organization and readiness to do all of these things immediately. How does the second Trump White House compare in terms of execution?
Well, I think they certainly were ready and prepared to come in. I think that there's people who have had the experience of the first administration. I think the president knows what he wants to accomplish. I think the biggest difference, though, is that 8 years ago, Donald Trump was still trying to solidify his support inside the Republican Party. Today, there's no question that he basically owns the Republican Party. And you can see that, frankly, with what's happened on Capitol Hill today. If you were to consider that you'd put forward perhaps the most pro-abortion person ever for Health and Human Services, who has said the NRA is a terrorist group, who has basically said there should be no oil production in America, and you tell me that person would be nominated for a Republican cabinet and all Republican senators would be falling in line behind it, I think he has a lot more support now inside our party, which gives him the freedom to kind of push forward on some more of his executive orders that he wants.
So not a fan of the RFK Jr. Nomination. Donald Trump also seems to think he owns the Fed. Mark, and Fed Chair Jay Powell had this to say earlier in his news conference about pressure from the new president.
I'm not going to have any response or comment whatsoever on what the president said. It's not appropriate for me to do so. The public should be confident that we will continue to do our work as we always have, focusing on using our tools to achieve our goals and really keeping our heads down and doing our work, and that's how we best serve the public. I've had no contact.
As we've reminded our audience, Mark, you were there in the first Trump administration. Is this just business as usual, or does Chair Powell have something to worry about?
No, I think that there's been a lot of happy talk in some of the confirmation hearings so far that the Fed will be independent and that the president will not interfere. I recall in the first administration, the president, I was in the Oval Office when we had several heated conversations with Secretary Mnuchin about recommending Powell in the first place, and have several heated conversations with Powell about why he should be reducing rates then. I don't think his patience is going to go very long in wanting to push for lower rates. And I think that the notion that that there's going to be this sort of Goldilocks period, I just think is mistaken. I think there's going to be a lot more turmoil in days ahead between the Fed and the president.
Well, looking forward to that. Marc, considering that you are joining us this evening from Capitol Hill, I do want to ask you about something that happened at the Capitol a little over 4 years ago. Obviously, the vice president that you were serving as chief of staff's life was threatened by a mob, nearly all of whom have now been pardoned by President Trump, one of his very first actions in office. How do you feel about it?
Well, yeah, I was there that day. I was evacuated with the vice president to a secure location underneath the Capitol. I think that those who assaulted our police officers should have been prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And I think it's a tragic mistake to suggest that they should all be pardoned so whimsically. I think it's a bad message for Republicans, who are supposed to be a party of law and order, to basically be exonerating those who assaulted our police officers. But I think it also, something's getting less conversation, is what happens the next time somebody assaults a political opponent under the expectation that Donald Trump is going to pardon him? You've sort of created the license to perhaps take additional violent actions, which I think is a grave mistake. And so I'm troubled to see that was one of the first actions that this administration decided was a priority.
Well, Marc, we appreciate your candor, and thank you very much for joining us. Marc Short, former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence. And coming up, as this week's Republican retreat down in Doral, Florida comes to an end, there's no clear path forward on reconciliation, as we were just discussing, and we'll have more on that with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There was a short-term pause or funding freeze on certain discretionary spending payments, such as government grants. This in no way affected Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or other entitlements that Americans depend on. We are merely looking at parts of the big bureaucracy where there has been tremendous waste and fraud and abuse.
President Trump earlier this afternoon, after his administration decided to reverse course on a major federal funding freeze. And joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is this evening's political panel, Sarah Chamberlain, president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership and Republican strategist, alongside Caitlin Legacki, Democratic strategist and former official in the Commerce Department under President Biden. Welcome to you both. Sarah, as we consider what this funding freeze was and why it created such an uproar and ultimately led to a court challenge, is because these are funds that were appropriated by Congress. The power of the purse does lie with them. Are members of the Republican Main Street Partnership upset with this effort on the Trump administration?
They are not. They understand where President Trump was going with this. Obviously, got a little bit out of control. He pulled it back in. But there are some serious problems that need to be addressed. Some of the funding, I happen to personally know someone who works in the government, makes $180,000 a year, has not stepped foot in the office in 10 years. Wow. So, there is a lot of waste here that I understand where the president is going to cut it out. Did he go a little too far with the freeze? Yes, but he's rolled that back. Hopefully, we will be able to clean up some of these departments that have too much spending and too much waste.
I think we need to meet this person.
It's ridiculous.
So was this just a botched rollout, or is there something really to worry about here? Because questions have not really been answered by the White House, and it doesn't seem that they have a real inventory of the programs that might be impacted.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly was poorly rolled out. It was poorly considered. It seems like it wasn't really considered at all. And I think, frankly, I agree that we should be getting federal workers back into the workplace. I think there are areas of agreement. The issue is that this was a total freeze of all federal funding that was sprung on the agencies. It was sprung on the states. It was sprung on Congress. And something of that scale has to be fully considered before you roll it out. And it's clear in the past, 48 hours that they've changed their minds 3 times on what they want to do. And at the end of the day, this affects cancer trials. It affects food stamps. It affects Medicaid payments that really affect people's lives. And I think that's why Democrats were so concerned is, you can make all the process arguments you want about the separation of powers. Yeah. But at the end of the day, this affects people's lives, and we have to be much more conscientious about that.
Well, when we consider the powers here, and obviously the appropriating powers do lie in Congress, and they have an appropriations battle looming. They were going to try to sort out some of those details down in Florida over the last few days, Sarah. But if Marjorie Taylor Greene is to be believed, no real plan is emerging. So where exactly do we stand? As Speaker Johnson is saying, markups start next week. They're trying to get the ball rolling.
So the Republican Main Street Partnership has a lot of appropriators, including the chairman. We've done a lot of work with him. Yeah. They will start marking up and getting the ball rolling. I'm not exactly sure what Marjorie Taylor Greene was talking about because they have had a lot of meetings and the appropriators are excited. They're really going to try this cycle, this year, to get through all the appropriation bills and get them
regular
passed.
Order.
Regular order. They really want to bring back regular order, and so does the Speaker, for that matter.
It could be an earthquake in Washington if that actually happened.
Hey, we've had one in the past.
Well, I guess I should watch that. Exactly. I'll hold on. But, you know, that would suggest that there is maybe a decision on one reconciliation bill. That's what Marjorie Taylor Greene was suggesting, that there's still nowhere on that front. What do you hear?
As I've said before, they want one. The House needs to have one for many reasons. And we do need a few Democrats, potentially, because there are some Republicans that really are Republicans in name only. They don't vote with the Republicans, so we do need to reach across the aisle and get some of the Democrats. So we all feel that one bill is probably the best way to get that done.
So to the Democrat.
Yes.
Are any Democrats going to get on board with this ultimately?
I think there are a couple who want to. You know, there's folks like Jared Golden, who's in a really tough district in Maine, who I think is inclined to get to yes, but that requires the Republican Party to not overplay their hand. And so I think that's where my questions are, is whether Republicans are going to have the restraint to go out and seek bipartisan compromise so they get the votes they need, or if you're going to have folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene calling the shots and pushing for an all-or-nothing dynamic that does make it a lot harder for Democrats to vote for this.
What did you think of the optics today, Donald Trump in the cross hall in the White House with service members lining the hallway in dress uniform as he actually walked out to approach the podium through these members of the military? What do the optics mean? Is the White House a military installation now?
It's quickly becoming one. You know, I think that there should be a lot of concern about the weaponization of government, the expansion of government or executive power that we're seeing already in the first 2 weeks.
I thought he won to fight the weaponization.
That's what they say. That's always projection. But you know, I think there are some things to be concerned about. I'm not going to lose sleep over the optics, but I do think there is a larger agenda at play that is seeking to dramatically expand executive power and presidential power, as we saw this week with freezing the federal funds that had been appropriated by Congress. And so for me, that's the bigger concern. I'm not going to go tweet about some optics, but I do think it is a thing that we all need to be mindful of.
Well, when he was at that podium, he also made a surprise announcement about his plans to build a new migrant holding facility in Guantanamo Bay. Listen.
Today, I'm also signing an executive order to instruct the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security to begin preparing the 30,000-person migrant facility at Guantanamo Bay. Most people don't even know about it. We have 30,000 beds in Guantanamo to detain the worst criminal illegal aliens threatening the American people.
But, Sarah, wouldn't Congress need to give him money for that effort?
They would. And I think maybe they will give him money for that. I think it's actually a great idea. I've been down to that facility. It gets these very terrible criminals, like the hardened criminals, off of American soil, which I think is great. Gets them down there. It's a
and
tough,
migrants fall into that category?
They do. They're here illegally, but they've committed a crime on American soil. It's a tough prison, though. I mean, I would not want to go there. Wow. It's hard living, but I don't think he's wrong. Let's get him off the mainland. Let's get him down there and get him in a place where they can't escape.
Caitlin, what do you think about this idea of essentially commingling migrants with accused international terrorists?
I think that there needs to be a comprehensive approach to immigration. We need to enforce our laws. I think my concern is that, one, are we actually only sending the most violent, hardened criminals, or is this an effort to tag every illegal alien or undocumented person as a violent criminal or as a terrorist and put them all in one bucket? That's where I have concern. But, I think the fact of the matter is we don't currently have 30,000 beds there, and it's going to cost a lot of money to get 30,000 beds there. And so, my recommendation to Democrats would be to put some strings on that funding and make sure that that is focused on only the most violent criminals.
Sure. Wow. We'll see what happens with this, and we'll keep you posted. And we'll stick with our panel as well. Sarah Chamberlain and Karoline Leavitt will be with us as we take a closer look at RFK Jr.'s Senate confirmation hearing. It happened today, and it's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
No one should be fooled here. As Secretary of HHS, Robert Kennedy will have the power to undercut vaccines and vaccine manufacturing across our country. And for all of his talk about follow the science and his promise that he won't interfere with those of us who want to vaccinate his kids, the bottom line is the same. Kennedy can kill off access to vaccines and make millions of dollars while he does it. Kids might die, but Robert Kennedy can keep cashing in.
Senator, I support vaccines. I support the childhood schedule. I will do that. The only thing I want is good science, and that's it.
Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, of course, fulfilling her role on the Senate Finance Committee today, sparring with Health Secretary nominee RFK Jr. Back with us, our political panel, Sarah Chamberlain and Karoline Leavitt. This went on for hours. Some pretty tough questions today. We covered vaccines. We covered reproductive rights. We covered some of his personal stories. We're told, though, this former Democrat has the votes to join the Trump administration. Is that how it ends?
It looks like it. You know, obviously we're expecting, I think, McConnell, Murkowski, and Collins to be the likeliest no votes. Whether he gets a fourth no vote doesn't seem obvious at this point in time. So,
does it affect access to vaccines?
I think it does, frankly. And this is a position where he will have a lot of control over federal funding for scientific research, for vaccine subsidies. It is alarming, and I think it's disappointing. But I also think that without a more organized Republican opposition, he's going to get through.
Of course, he'll have another day of testimony tomorrow before the Health Committee, where a doctor in the Senate, Bill Cassidy, will be presiding, although he didn't seem super critical of RFK Jr. today. And it will be overshadowed anyway by the other hearing happening tomorrow, Sarah, for Tulsi Gabbard, for Director of National Intelligence. How rough is that one going to be?
I think that one's going to be extremely rough. I actually think Kennedy makes it through. I think that maybe J.D. Vance has to come down and cast the tie-breaking vote. But I think she will be the one that, if they choose not to take one down, one of the nominees down, I think it's going to be her. And I think what you're going to find, it's going to be 6 or 7 members, not 3 or 4, not 4, I guess you'd need. Sure. I think they're going to be a group of them that would do it, so you can't just blame it on 1 or 2.
Knowing that she cannot afford to lose a single vote in committee. Is that where this happens? She doesn't even get out of committee to a floor vote.
I think her committee, I think it's going to be tough to get her out of committee at this point. But we'll see. I mean, I don't know.
That would be consistent with what we've heard. It's Republicans who would end up doing in this nomination.
Well, and while I guess we all will be focused on Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel is also having his hearing on the same day, which usually I would guess would draw just as much attention, at least from Democrats who are critical of his nomination.
Yes. It's certainly not my choice to run the FBI. I think, though, that Sarah's correct that Tulsi Gabbard is going to get all the attention. She's going to get the vast majority of the coverage, but also the body blows. And that's going to create space for other nominees to slip through at least a little bit from a media perspective, more unscathed. But, you know, part of this is about establishing a congressional record of statements so that when and if Congress does need to fulfill its oversight duties, it has that ability to do so. And so it's not all for nothing, but I think it is going to be difficult for Democrats to stop most of these nominees.
So what does Richard Burr say tomorrow when he introduces her? Believe me or your lion eyes? I mean, he brings enormous credibility.
He brings huge credibility. As the former chairman, I mean, I think he brings a lot, but I don't think it's going to help. I've been wrong before, but I think this I think this is the one. Yeah. If there's one, this is the one that they take down.
You have 3 screens up tomorrow.
Yeah, it's going to be a busy day. Shocking. We never have any of those in Washington anymore. Sarah Chamberlain and Caitlin Legacki, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much. In fact, it's been so busy, Joe, that we didn't mention another story. Former Democratic Senator from New Jersey, Bob Menendez, today sentenced to 11 years in prison for bribery and acting as a foreign agent of Egypt.
Another footnote on this day would have been a lead story on any other, but that's where we are in Washington.
Of course, you can get coverage of all of these stories in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal, and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We will do this all over again and distill all of those hearings for you. Meet us back here this time tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.